I'm Elaine Verveer, the director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. This discussion is the third in a four-part series on the role of women in post-conflict reconstruction. And we are co-sponsoring it today with the UN permanent missions from the United Arab Emirates and Canada. The recommendations of this series, which is taking place in this year of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325. This year, that anniversary will be marked, as it always is, in October. The recommendations from these discussions are going to inform a joint research report that we are doing in conjunction with the UAE on post-conflict reconstruction, and it will be launched later this year. We are also pleased today to share findings from the UN High-Level Group's report on justice for women and access to justice amidst COVID. Both have been co-authored by our Institute's Managing Director, Jenny Klugman, and published jointly by UN Women, IDLO, UNDP, UNODC, the World Bank, and the Pathfinders for Justice, with support from the elders. We would like to welcome all of our virtual participants, each and every one of you, over some 600 today, from 105 countries, so we're traversing many time zones. There are several UN permanent representatives joining us for today's program, and I want to acknowledge the representatives from Tonga, Mongolia, Namibia, the Marshall Islands, Barbados, El Salvador, Eritrea, and the Maldives, and the staffs from another 32 UN missions. So welcome all. Lastly, a note on logistics before we get started. We have already received many pre-submitted questions from our audience members, but you will also have an opportunity to ask questions during the discussion. Merely submit them by using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Add your name, your organization, and to whom your question is directed. And now we will begin. And my favorite part in this partnership, this long-standing partnership with the United Arab Emirates mission to the UN, is to welcome their ambassador, Lana Nasebe. She is currently the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Negotiations on the Security Council reform and was previously the vice president of the General Assembly's 73rd session, as well as other roles she has been playing at the UN in addition to her responsibilities at the mission. She has also worked within the UAE Foreign Ministry, serving as the UAE Special Envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think by any definition, she is a force of nature and a truly dynamic leader who is deeply committed to making greater progress on the 1325 agenda. So Lana, welcome.
Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on women's access to justice in post-conflict settings. Before we begin, I really want to thank the trailblazer in this field, our moderator, our host, Ambassador Milan Verveer, as well as the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security for its enduring partnership. This panel is the third in our series on advancing the role of women in the reconstruction of societies following war and conflict. And we're really honored that Canada, one of the first and most ardent WPS champions, is co-hosting with us today. This panel series focuses on the post-conflict window because it is a rare and crucial moment to address injustices faced by women during times of conflict and to transform underlying inequalities and gender-based discrimination. In all situations of conflict, we already know women are disproportionately affected by sexual and gender-based violence, forced displacement, asset loss and theft, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and human rights violations around the world. And the legacy of this upheaval endures long after a peace agreement is signed, crippling economic recovery and jeopardizing the sustainability of peace. Justice and the rule of law are critical components of the post-conflict equation for women, simply because the transition period represents an entry point to secure the full and fair inclusion of women and girls in the transformation of norms and the systems that we all uphold. And this is achieved through new constitutions, legislative reforms, and institution building. Prioritizing these pillars of a well-functioning society not only fosters public faith in the new government by ending impunity, it can also resolve situations in which women and their families have been stripped of the ability to earn livelihoods. In the past 3 decades, significant gains have been made in building an international justice architecture that includes accountability for sexual and gender-based crimes. The prosecution of these crimes serves as an important signaling of a break with the past, an assertion of the equal rights of women, and an international willingness to protect and uphold these rights. For the first time in history, sexual and gender-based violence in conflict can be prosecuted in the highest courts in the world. However, actual prosecution remains limited, and when we evaluate justice at the national level, progress is uneven. Looking beyond sexual and gender-based violence to gender equality more broadly, justice systems also often exclude women, both in terms of positions within courts and in terms of the laws and processes that would enable access and legal protection, intensifying discrimination and inequality that hampers their lives and the broader economy. Today, we will look at concrete examples of how experts and key stakeholders have both succeeded and struggled to change these circumstances for women as countries emerge from conflict and rebuild their justice systems. We have a really highly distinguished panel representing decades of experience in some of the most extreme and promising post-conflict settings around the world, and they will help us to unpack and evaluate strategies for increasing women's meaningful participation in decision-making and improving the design and implementation of gender-sensitive legal systems. Our aim is to identify a set of recommendations on how the UN, member states, and stakeholders can build and support gender-responsive justice systems, such that best practice becomes standard operating practice when the UN and its partners engage in conflict and post-conflict settings. Back home in the UAE, our constitution guarantees equal rights to all its citizens, women and men, as well as access to justice. We have seen firsthand that a strong framework of laws to protect women's rights, backed by effective security and judicial institutions to enforce these rights, has enabled our country's economic growth and stability. Beyond this legislative framework, the government continues to mainstream and promote gender equality and justice within all public institutions, with a focus on raising awareness through the education system. These concepts have shown us a pathway towards accessing justice, with the opportunity to build a more prosperous and peaceful world through the empowerment of women and men. Today should provide an excellent platform for engagement on these topics, and I look forward to a stimulating and productive discussion with all our panelists. Thank you, Milan, again for your partnership.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Nasebe, and thank you for the wonderful perspective you have just brought to this discussion, framing it for us and telling us what the stakes are in terms of its great importance. We're now going to move to our other co-host today, which is the Government of Canada. Jacqueline O'Neill is Canada's first ambassador for women, peace, and security. Throughout her career, she has been an extraordinary leader on this issue. I think she is known around the world for her leadership on women, peace, and security, providing strategic advice to more than 30 countries, multilateral organizations, and her own government. Earlier, she was president of the Institute for Inclusive Security, and she has worked at the UN peacekeeping mission in Sudan and in other posts. I might add that prior to her return to Canada, She was an adjunct professor on women, peace, and security at Georgetown. So we feel that she is part family too, if we can claim you, Jackie. And as Ambassador Nusebe just said, Canada has been an exceptional leader on this issue, and so it is so appropriate to have your government join us as a co-host today and to have you with us to help us in terms of laying out the importance of this discussion. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you, Milan, and thanks for brilliant framing, Ambassador Nusebe. That was an excellent overview. I'm very happy to bring greetings to all of you from Ottawa, Canada, where I'm happy to say the weather is not currently about 700 degrees. You know, there are not many windows in the year where we can brag about our weather here, but this is one of them. So we're very happy to come to you from Ottawa. And, you know, Canada's just really delighted to be supporting this event with our wonderful friends at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, who are indeed part family, Milan. The Institute has long made crucial contributions to this field. And I must say that these webinars, Milan and team, you know, especially in the early days of the pandemic, have really been a lifeline for so many of us to keep connected with each other and also to keep centered on listening directly to women peace builders around the world. So thank you for that. We're also really delighted as Canada to be co-hosting along with our colleagues from the United Arab Emirates. As you would expect, there are some fantastic women driving our relationships, not least Ambassador Nusebe in New York, also Canada's ambassador to the UAE, Marcy Grossman, who's watching and joining us today. It's been great to collaborate in fora like the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security at the UN, and maybe even someday on the Kaula Bint Azwar Military Academy, the region's first military college for women. And I must say really briefly, we are all just so taken with Al Amal, the UAE's historic launch this week of the Mars Hope probe, not least because it's amazing, period, at a time that we all need it. But also, as we understand, the team was made up, the mission team is over a third women, and women constituted about 80% of the science team. So very cool on all fronts and a great partnership. So I don't want to stand in the way of hearing from our panelists, just want to share one last thought, which is that access to justice, like every theme discussed in this great series, was at crisis levels before this pandemic. And it's no doubt getting worse as a result of it. And I think the challenge of our time, to so many of us on this webinar who are focused on changing systems, is to seize the opportunities presented by disruption on this scale. And people living in post-conflict contexts know better than anyone that massive disruption can be both devastating and it can present windows to accelerate certain type of change. Ambassador Nusebe mentioned entry points. And we know that positive change isn't going to happen unless we are deliberate and organized in pursuing it. So the forces that are exploiting this crisis need to be overwhelmed by the forces that want to make positive fundamental change as a result. And that's what Canada's feminist foreign policy is designed to do, to reduce inequality in all its forms. And we're really focused on how the pandemic can be a window to accelerating that, as can the Black Lives Matter movement and the focus on structural racism that has held so many people back for so many years. You know, we know justice can take many forms, it's not just legal, and there's no doubt that truly systemic reforms of institutions is part of that pursuit. So we can't wait to hear from our panelists. Thanks for this great partnership, and we turn it back to you, Milan.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you for those words about the call to action, the need to be deliberate and organized on so many fronts in addressing our challenges. And one of those key challenges is the one we're discussing today: justice, especially inclusive justice in post-conflict situations. We're going to turn now to our distinguished and expert panel. And our first panelist is Dr. Sandy Okoro, who was the Senior Vice President and General Counsel at the World Bank and Vice President for Compliance there. She was the convener of the high-level Group on Justice for Women, along with the Director of UN Women. She is an ardent defender and champion for women's empowerment and gender equality. She has held positions in England as president of the International Lawyers of Africa, as well as top posts in the private sector in financial institutions. So we are absolutely delighted to have Sandy with us today. And let me begin, Sandy, by asking you about this world in which we find ourselves today, the pandemic affected world. Perhaps you can tell us how COVID-19 has been exacerbating challenges to inclusive justice, and what the World Bank is doing in its work in stabilization of fragile states and states that are coming out of conflict, particularly with the justice factor, which is our theme today. How is justice critical to stabilization? And where are the largest gaps for women in justice? Perhaps what is driving those gaps? And maybe a little bit from the key findings from your high-level report. I know it's a lot to ask, but you're at the World Bank. You've got this terrific effort going forward on stabilization in fragile and conflict-affected states. How does that fit in with justice? And then let's go to the report and what it tells us about women and the gaps that continue to exist. So take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. And good morning, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, fellow panelists. Special hello to Jenny Klugman. Usually at this time of year, we'd have bumped into each other a number of times, but because of COVID, we haven't. So hello to all of you. What a great question. What an all-encompassing question. And I know time is of the essence, so I'll try and deal with things all at once. Let me just be very clear here. Women are half the population of nearly any country. So everything we're about to talk about has a significant effect. Sometimes women are put in the bucket of minorities. We're not a minority. We're 50, sometimes 51% of a population. I think we must remember this as we have this discussion going forward. And thank you for referring to the Justice for Women report. And we did a companion piece as well in relation to COVID-19. And the report is very much linked to SDG 5 and SDG 16, which is the gender, and I like to say the justice piece of it. So everything sort of comes together. But let me give you some of the, let me start with the report, if I may, and some of the key challenges, because I think that will drive and answer some of the other questions that you had. So 1 in 3 women experience violence at the hands of an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 3. That is very, very, very high. And more than 1 billion women lacked protection from sexual violence from intimate partners in 2018. So if you extrapolate that into the world we're in now in a COVID environment, you can imagine how difficult that is for women. Because in lockdown, in the homes, many women are in the informal sector as well. And so jobs, economic empowerment will have dried up, and children are at home as well. So that exposure to domestic violence, the exposure to sexual violence has been heightened because of the pandemic. It is always heightened in times of conflict, and the pandemic is mirroring some of those types of issues that conflict brings. Not the same, but some of those issues that conflict brings. So this is a very difficult time for women. If you also look at women's access to law enforcement, women's access to justice, in the time, and that was one of the things we picked up in the report as well. If you think in a time of pandemic when the justice system has to prioritize, many of the cases relating to women, family law cases, cases of sexual violence may not have the priority they need. Access to forensics, which are very important in sexual violence cases very quickly, just won't be there. And we know in some cases that, of course, because of the social distancing you need? Can they get the examinations? Can they get the treatment that they need that might be required for evidence in a case later? So for all women across the world, the pandemic has been something that has set many of the agendas we have pushed forward back. And in this post-pandemic world that we should be in, where we hope to be in shortly, we mustn't let that be at the bottom of the pile when it comes to priorities of picking things back up again. We've got to be very, very careful about that. If you look at discrimination, the report looked at discrimination at work. In 104 countries, women cannot get the same jobs as men. They just can't do the same jobs. That's written into the legislation. And in 94 countries, non-discrimination in hiring is not mandated. So again, when you look at the pandemic world, when you look at everything we have to rebuild post this, we've got to not forget to do this at the same time. And actually, we should be giving this priority. As I said, women are 50% of the population. So when we come to this post-pandemic world, we need to really be making sure as a priority that we are putting women at the center of this as well. And as we know in post-conflict, women play such an important part in peace building. History will show you this. But if you don't give them a lot of the rights and the economic freedoms, etc., how are they going to play their part that all the countries need? And it is so complicated, I think, right now. And as nearly every country in the world is working out their priorities in the post-COVID world, women's issues, women's access to justice, women's freedoms, including their reproductive health rights and their rights to family, are very important. One of the key findings in the report as well that I think is very, very important is not all women have an equal right to identity and inheritance. And this can really hold women back. And identity can stop you from accessing the justice system as well. If you don't have your identity card, you don't have those rights, how are you going to take your case to court? How are you going to prove who you were? How are you going to prove, you know, that your daughter was underage and therefore it is a different kind of sex attack? So all these things, I met many women in my travels on mission, are real issues on the ground for women. And my concern, and I know that of many women, is that as in this current COVID world and the post-COVID world, just like in times of conflict, how are we going to ensure that these remain priorities and don't go to the bottom of the pile as other things become important? And just some of the other things that we found as well, in 17 countries, women could not travel outside of their home without permissions of their husband. They could, and therefore you can't take your children with you. And I mentioned identity cards, and in 11 economies, women can't obtain national identity cards in the same way as men. These are real issues. So how do we tackle them? And I've mentioned making sure they remain a priority. We at the World Bank as well, we mainstream gender issues. We also now need to, and we're pushing for this, and the governance team at the bank and my team in legal are bringing these governance and these justice issues to the fore. Because if you want sustainable progress, if you want sustainable development, if you want to really embed the gender progress we have made and we want to make, then we're going to have to look at the justice systems as well, because the report clearly outlines the real differences between men and women in that sense. So we have to embed it from the beginning, not an afterthought, from the beginning, and prioritize it. Justice is not always something you can point to and say, there it is. But it's something you know you haven't got when you haven't got it. And we really need, and I think all multilateral organizations need to give this focus, and they need to give focus to this when it comes to the lack of equality women have to access justice across the world in many ways. I will stop there because there are a lot of other voices to be heard. I could say way more, but I just wanted to give that flavor, which I hope leads a direction for the conversation as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandy. And I think as we're discussing today, women's full participation in post-conflict settings is hugely constrained by the very issues that you pointed out. And yet there's such a huge necessity that justice be rendered in these ways so that they can be fully participating. So you've given us this broad outline from the report mostly, which is a really important contribution. And now we want to go more to the specific realization of these points. We're going to turn to lessons learned in post-conflict Guatemala. Claudia Pazipaz was the first female Attorney General of Guatemala. She's also the former Secretary for Multidimensional Security at the Organization of American States. She is currently the director of the Mexico and Central American Program at the Center for Justice and International Law in Costa Rica, from where she is coming to us today. Under her leadership in Guatemala, her country, for the first time, witnessed record-breaking prosecutions in cases involving the perpetrating of violence and human rights violations on a massive scale. There were record numbers of domestic violence cases brought and laws enforced. I remember so vividly meeting with a group of women at a shelter center in Guatemala who had been survivors of unimaginable abuse. And one of them said that as a result of what was happening in her country at the time, when Claudia was Attorney General, she said, "We were hopeless, but now we believe that justice is truly possible in our country." And justice and coming out of conflict go hand in hand. So Claudia, I'm so pleased you're with us today. As Attorney General, you truly worked assiduously to strengthen the rule of law. You were at the forefront of the fight to bring those responsible for mass human rights abuses to justice. And you made violence against women a priority because you knew these issues had to be addressed if sustainable peace was ever going to be possible. So what were those critical factors that enabled you and your country that was in a post-conflict situation to make progress on these issues, so much so that you made them a priority? Your government at the time made them a priority. And what were the biggest challenges that you encountered in doing that, in providing access to justice, particularly for women? And in the process of dealing with those challenges, what were the interventions that worked? What made a difference? So please give us the wealth of your experience on this issue.
Thank you so much, Milan, for the invitation, and good morning to everyone. I think that speaking about the critical factors, one of them, and it is very important, is to understand the obstacles that women survivors of violence face in accessing to justice. Before my work as Attorney General, when I was a human rights defender and academic, I researched how officials blame the victims, doubt their stories, made invisible the violence they suffer, and did everything possible to have their complaints dropped. Despite being the most prevalent crime and the fact that the women's lives are at risk, they often considered violence against women as a less serious crime. So by better understanding these obstacles, then when I became Attorney General, we designed internal policies that aim at overcoming them. I think that the second critical factor, and you mentioned it, the second critical factor to make progress possible was political will at the highest level. One of my major commitments as Attorney General was to address violence against women and to prosecute and punish serious human rights violations that occurred during the civil war in Guatemala. With these clear priorities, we allocated the resources, we created specialized teams to best deal with this type of crime. Particularly, as you asked me, in the case of women, violence against women and sexual violence, we established the model of comprehensive care that brings together in one place clinical doctors, forensic doctors, psychologists, social workers, prosecutors, police, judges that work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Through this model, a survivor of violence can find in one place all the help, care, and protection that she needs without having to go to different offices and without having to choose between health or justice. And the third factor that is very important was to establish alliances with human rights and women's organizations. As we all know, in order to pursue justice, it is critical to gain the trust of the survivors because many of them already distrust the justice system, fearing their voices will not be heard, that they will potentially be re-victimized, and that impunity will prevail. Human rights organizations and women's organizations make it possible to establish channels of communication and trust, especially in cases of serious human rights violations, where victims have been denied access to justice for decades. And this is really not easy. Establishing these alliances, this bridge of communication and trust, does pose its challenges, however, because many times officials understand that if they establish this relationship with victims or civil society organizations, they are losing their impartiality or their independence. In this sense, it is necessary to reconceptualize the public's function and understand it as it is service to the victims and service to the citizens. I will leave my answers there, Milan.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I think that both shows us how this has to be a clearly thought out priority that's set, and also the kinds of decisions that get made in terms of what needs to be done. And we'll come back and ask you some more specifics in the next round. I now want to move from Guatemala to Afghanistan and the importance of inclusive justice there. Fazel Rahim is a former USAID Afghan gender advisor. Today, he is a gender integration and training specialist at Encompass, a position in which he continues to work with USAID and the UN to ensure that their development initiatives are gender inclusive. He has also great experience working with UNDP and the World Child Organization in the UK. He began his career as a legal counselor for imprisoned women and an advocate against gender-based violence. He is a truly committed male ally, and I know that he was named earlier as an honorary Afghan woman, and I think that's well-deserved, Fazel, for your deep commitment to addressing these issues. So let me ask you, You've worked over many, many years now on strengthening fair and equitable justice systems in Afghanistan. We know that the country continues to be challenged in so many ways. Women have indeed made great progress, but it's precarious because we don't know what will happen going forward. So tell us about what some of those gains have been in the informal and formal justice systems in the sectors for both. What is at stake for inclusive justice in the current peace process? And how do we work to expand those gains and ensure that they will be sustainable? So Fazelle, your wisdom, please.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, honorable ambassadors, distinguished panelists, respected participants from all over the world. I hope you're all doing well, safe and healthy with your families and loved ones. And it's also such an humbling honor for myself to be a voice of advocacy for Afghan women during such a critical moment in the history of Afghanistan as we are entering into, hopefully, the intra-Afghan peace talks with the Taliban. And lastly, an incredible transformative journey for myself being an advocate for women's rights and equality. I would like to start by saying that based on the United Nations reports, Afghanistan has one of the highest young population. It's estimated that more than 70% of the Afghan population are under the age of 25 years of age. That is incredible, both in terms of opportunities, but also threats to the longer-term peace and stability in Afghanistan. Again, according to the UN, Afghan women make up to more than 50% of the Afghan population. Any setbacks for Afghan women means setback for every single Afghan, regardless of their gender and sex and orientation. An Afghanistan that does not give justice and ensure justice to women and girls is one that wouldn't experience lasting, durable peace and stability for all citizens. And we have an Afghan proverb that says, "A bird with one wing cannot fly." The exclusion of women being the second wing of that bird is disastrous for the future of the country. Let me also very quickly pause here, take a step back and celebrate our collective achievements since the early days of Afghanistan after the collapse of the Taliban regime. A special congratulations to Afghan women and girls from all walks of life and every corner of the country for their resilience and constant fight against all forms of oppression, persecution, domestic violence, persecuted on them, and amplified by harsh and harmful traditions and practices. Violence perpetrated by both patriarchal and corrupt state actors and institutions, and non-state violent extremist and terrorist groups and organizations, as well as criminal groups, and especially drug criminal groups. Let's briefly showcase a few highlights of these achievements in the past almost 19 years. First, in the policy and legislative reform, the fact that we have an enshrinement of the Article of Equality among all citizens is a key foundational first step for achieving gender justice and equality in Afghanistan in the past 19 years. The country is signatory to key international conventions and protocols related to women's, girls, and child protection. Furthermore, the enaction of the implementation of elimination of violence against forms of violence law, the law on protection of child rights, the juvenile code reform, and reforms in penal civil laws are critically important milestones for women and girls' access to justice in Afghanistan. So let's all of us celebrate these achievements. And lastly, I would like to highlight the National Action Plan for UN Security Council Resolution 1325, Women's Peace and Security, that was developed in close collaboration with Afghan women's civil society organizations and women's rights. In the civic education and community awareness, with the help of international community, through various mediums and platforms, we have been able to reach to every corner of Afghanistan to raise citizens' awareness on human rights, women's rights, and children's rights. Criminal justice reform is another key achievement. We've had considerable gender-sensitive reforms in the Afghan police, the Attorney General's office, the court systems, the prison systems, and that has significantly contributed to much improved access to justice for Afghan women, although it could be limited to urban areas and there are concerns in rural areas. Presence of women in the justice system and also working with men in the justice sector. While not significant, unfortunately, but we have women in the law enforcement, in the justice system is improving significantly. We have female judges, we have female prosecutors, we have attorneys, we have defense lawyers and advocates in major urban areas and to some extent limited rural areas. The launch of pilot special prosecution and court units for addressing violence against women cases. I can continue to add to the list of all these achievements, but due to limited time, I would like to end with sharing improvements, limited improvements in traditional dispute resolution or informal justice system in Afghanistan in the past 18, 19 years. While there is much to be done at the countrywide scale, key achievements is ensuring that TDR and institutions work closely with formal justice system institutions and working with male members and heads of villages and community leaders who are part of these institutions for educating them on women's rights and engaging with religious institutions. This is really, really important to know that with the help of international community, Afghanistan is a successful case for justice and equality post-Taliban. But as the coalition forces are working with the Afghan government and the Taliban to negotiate an exit for this long years of war, and with the current peace process, the future is at stake and bleak for Afghan women and girls. We are worried of not only being able to maintain the gains that I just highlighted, but we're also fearful that we would lose them. The status of women would face a significant setback, especially in the justice sector. And the issue of women's rights would no longer be a priority for all the stakeholders, and that they could be compromised. That could be resulting in persecution of violence and oppression against women. So I would like to stop here and we'll talk about recommendations. But I also want to highlight that these are across, not only limited to Afghanistan, but across the region in the Middle East and North Africa, countries facing similar situation as Afghanistan. These are common, both the achievements and the challenges. Thank you, and back to you, Ambassador.
No, thank you, Fazel. And I think it's really worth truly understanding, particularly at this moment, what is at stake. You just laid out a series of gains that have been made. And if they are pushed back, if they are eviscerated, it's obviously a horrible situation for women in Afghanistan, but it also means that the country will not have a sustainable, peaceful future. So much is at stake, as you just said. And I'm glad you touched on the informal justice sector as well. Excuse me, because so often we don't understand how that operates similarly. I want to go back now to Sandy as we look at the way forward and how we might continue to not just sustain gains where they've been made, close those gaps where they exist because they're still extensive. But what can the multilateral community do? Sandy, you're at the World Bank. What greater steps can the multilateral organizations be taking on these issues? Because they're very active, particularly in stabilizing fragile states and in these post-conflict movement to recovery settings that we're discussing today.
Thank you, and a great question as well. And I was looking at some of the questions on the chat as well to see what sort of things were coming up, and just connected to this in terms of what the multilaterals can do. Well, we can do a lot. We work with our member countries, and we do not tell them what to do, but we can help them with their aspirations in terms of what they want to do. And again, going back to what I said at the beginning, is making sure what they put in place is sustainable. And without addressing 50% of the population and the needs of that 50% of the population, you will not get sustainable development. So it comes down to something as basic as that, I think. So in other words, more action, less talking. Let's get on with it. Just a few things that spring to mind really is it's important to remove the legal barriers that exist for access to justice for women. Because without doing that, you are not going to get that move forward that is required. And as we've all said in this, in the world of COVID and post-COVID, there's a worry that things will go backwards and go back even further back to where we were before COVID. I think raising awareness is a really important thing, and now's an opportunity because lots of things, and somebody mentioned Black Lives Matter earlier. We're in a time where we're listening, okay, in a way never before, and so we need to listen to all these issues and raise awareness about women's rights and protections, and capacity building as well is really important. And so we need more female lawyers, we need more female judges, we need to really build that capacity in the system. Without it, we're not going to see the kind of change further down the line that we need. And there is such a lag in that, actually, that is really important. And some free access to services, I think, for women as well. And there have been some interesting things that have been happening in a number of countries in this sort of post-conflict and the COVID world that I've been looking at, and one of them was in Bogota, Colombia, where, for example, because things are different now, access to facilities are different, is using trusted networks, and where actually women can go and report sexual violence in a local drugstore, and that trusted network will send the information on. So there are all these different things of using the digital side, the innovative side, the trusted network side, getting more women involved in the judicial system, and all the areas that I mentioned before. We as multilaterals can encourage our governments to invest. Because we lend money to our member countries. That's what we do at the bank. And that is part of their plan for development. We have influence, but we can't tell them what to do. But we can provide a lot of data, we can provide a lot of influence, we can provide a lot of guidance. And we really need to, particularly now, is mainstream gender more, mainstream the justice issues more for women, so that actually what you get is something different to what we had before. And this is a time where we need to highlight it, because, as I say, everybody is in listening mode, everybody is in a mode where things need to change, and everything has been upended. We cannot underestimate, I think, in any way, shape or form, the enormous detrimental impact COVID has had on women and young girls. I wanted to mention young girls, actually, because we know education has been disrupted for children across the world. But when you get into some of the more challenging places in this world, young girls' education could have been put back even further, and they may not be able to retrieve that. They may not be able to get that lost education back. So when we look at all these aspects and the current world that we're in as MDBs and what we are going to help our member countries move forward with in their development programs, we mustn't forget the impact that this has had on young girls and women, and make sure it's built into our program specifically, not at the side, but built in specifically to address this, because it just won't happen by osmosis. It has to happen by planning. There are lots of reports out there. There's our report out there, but the information is there. We have to build it in, and we have to work with governments to realize the importance of this. And we know the importance of women in peace building. We know the importance of women in the judicial system to change things, but we now have to take action, I think, and really build that in. And I would say to many of the multilaterals, don't think of justice and rule of law and access to justice as a side issue, right? As something that comes along just because you want it to come along. It doesn't. You have to build it in. And we've all seen this where we are, and I think as well, you know, we mentioned Black Lives Matter before. You have things that are systemic, and the way that women are held back is systemic in many ways. We've talked about some of the laws, ID cards, not being able to inherit from your father or your husband or whatever. Some of these are systemic and in laws, and we're never going to address this gender inequality if we don't look at that as well. We can't tell our member countries to change their laws, but we can encourage them to look at the impact their laws have in their development goals and their development outcomes. And by leveling the playing field and making things equal when it comes to gender, you are going to improve your development outcomes in a sustainable way for generations to come. And having that conversation, and also, to be honest, I'm not an economist, but getting the economists to work on some of that data as well, and seeing what we can do when it comes to justice too, I think would be important. Let me leave it at that.
Well, that's great, Sandy. And I think particularly you're saying that this is not a side issue. It can't be a side issue, and it's got to rise to that priority level because so much is at stake in terms of what it represents for better futures going forward, particularly in these very difficult settings. Claudia, I want to go back to you now for a moment. You go from one challenging job to another. You are now overseeing regional operations for the Center for International Justice and International Law. Much of the region where you find yourself is racked by violence, especially violence against women. What is working in terms of interventions, and what better can governments be doing, and again, multilaterals be doing in these situations to promote inclusive justice? Because it's clearly at a stage that is off the charts in terms of its pervasiveness. The nature of the violence is pervasive. So what can be done, and what do you know from your own experience that's working?
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think that the Latin American region, and especially the Central American region, as you just said, is a region with one, for example, with one of the highest murder rates in the world. And in this context, women are among the main victims, whether due to gender-based violence, violence committed by gangs, drug trafficking, and also due to violence committed by state actors. And one factor that has increased violence in general, but violence against women in particular, is the growing militarization of internal security. For example, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have all turned to the military to address the growing insecurity, despite the many voices of women organizations, human rights bodies that warn it is not the solution. And that, on the contrary, the presence of the military actually increases human rights violations and crimes against women. Therefore, I think that it is crucial that states strongly limit the use of military forces to deal with insecurity. And I believe it is essential that the states commit to build strong institutions, to focus on measures to reduce impunity and to prevent future crimes. In this regard, a novel mechanism for documenting and preventing violence against women by state actors is the one ordered by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the case regarding women survivors of sexual violence. The case is Atenco.
Did we lose Claudia?
Dr. Pazipaz is reconnecting. Perhaps we can revisit her on the next round.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the connection is not good.
Are
So
you
where I
back?
was, yes, I am back. Where was I?
You were talking about the situation in the specific countries.
So I think that to track and to monitor this violence by specific state actors, there is a novel mechanism for documenting and preventing violence against women. And it was ordered by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the case regarding women survivors of sexual violence, Atenco versus Mexico. And in this decision, the Inter-American Court ordered the creation of an independent observatory with civil society participation to verify the use of force by state security forces. Also, this ruling is binding in Mexico. This type of monitoring can be established in different countries. In contexts of high impunity, a mechanism like this can help in understanding the magnitude of gender-based violence perpetrated by state agents, and from there help to design policies to prevent, investigate, and sanction this type of crimes. And as the last point, I want to emphasize that having women actively adjudicating cases and participating in the administration of justice also makes a difference for accountability on gender-based violence. A key factor pointed out by the Resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council is that states must ensure the participation of women at all levels increases, and also that the Secretary General of the UN appoints more representatives as the special envoys and special envoys. I want to ask states and institutions to further engage with the Equal campaign that seeks to increase the participation of women in international courts and in human rights bodies. In this regard, states and multilateral organizations should support a greater representation of women in justice and peace processes, because as we all have said and we all know, they ensure a greater access to justice for women and a sustainable peace. I will stop there.
Claudia, those are just excellent recommendations. And I think we often talk about the participation of women and not enough about their participation in the justice systems and the critical role that they play and the sensitivity that they bring to these issues. And your monitoring example, I think, is also a very good one, and we should stay apprised of what is happening with that and how one can move from the monitoring to the determinations that it makes so that programs and policies can be put in place. So thank you for that. And Fazelle, to round this out, you talked about the gains in Afghanistan for inclusive justice, significant gains, I might add. What recommendations do you have to sustain goals to both countries in the region beyond Afghanistan, as well as to the multilats, as to how this should continue to be a priority in going forward?
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to first highlight that one immediate concern that is going to impact Afghanistan and countries, the type of Afghanistan context in the world, throughout the world, is COVID-19 and our response, our collective response to COVID-19. The impact it has on women and girls as frontline fighters, I call. The IDPs, women in the refugee camps, and their access to humanitarian assistance, especially in a competing world where a lot of donors and governments are reallocating resources to address internal needs, unfortunately, is going to have a very consequential, both short-term and longer-term access to justice and services. And this issue is underspoken, is not that significant attention has been paid to. We are hearing horrific examples of cases of sexual and labor trafficking. We are hearing cases of early enforced marriages. We are hearing lack of access to justice and protection because of mobility issues, because of women's lack of access to mobile phones and technology, as a lot of law and order institutions and judicial systems are closing in Afghanistan and other countries due to the stay-at-home orders. Lack of women's access to shelters due to lack of resources, unfortunately, and dangers of COVID. So both in longer term, the impact is going to be devastating for women and girls and other vulnerable population. All actors, government and non-government and civil society organizations, need to put hands together to assess the situation in all these countries, to find out the gaps and the issues and ways that we can practically and very quickly reach out to these women, of course, other members of the population. Secondly, I'm talking about, as the US government and the coalition forces in collaboration with the international community are working together for the exit strategy for Afghanistan, working with the Afghan counterparts, it's really important that all of these stakeholders, private sector, public sector, and international partners, do a comprehensive and countrywide gender analysis of the country that is required by the Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017. The act clearly states that the US government should provide, and I'm quoting, technical assistance and training to female negotiators, peace builders, and stakeholders, non-government and private sector entities engaged or affected by conflict prevention and stabilization and peace building. That is the exact time in Afghanistan. We are also required to address security-related barriers to women's participation. We have to encourage increased participation of US-funded programs, whether it's military or civilian, and this is across all US government agencies. We also provide support to local organizations, especially women's groups. In the case of Afghanistan, I would like to highlight several frontline strong women champions and organizations, such as the Afghan Women's Network and others, and also making sure that women are part of the peace building process. So that expanded gender analysis will help us, the reality, as we are engaging with the Afghan government, with the Taliban, with elite political parties and interlocutors. Earlier in my narrative, I talked about the youth population. I talked about women. How can we reach out and hear from them? What are their concerns? What are their priorities for the intra-Afghan talks and post-talk scenario in the most successful scenario? I'm not talking about the worst case scenario. That is not the focus of my conversation here. So this is really critical that we do that. And this really applies all over the world, whether you're talking about Afghanistan or Syria or Yemen or Somalia or South Sudan, even in Central and Latin American countries facing the same situation. The third really priority that I see is really important for our success is the expanded and renewed role of UNAMA, United Nations Assistance Mission for Afghanistan, and other UN sister agencies, whether it's the UNSF, the UNFPA, the UNDP. I think that the Security Council needs to revisit that role of the UN in Afghanistan and countries the same context. It is critically important that they have an expanded role to support, monitor, observe, and even provide technical support assistance during pre-negotiations, during the intra-Afghan negotiations, post-talks, agreements, or whatever the settlement we have. In best case scenario, at least I want to reiterate, I'm not focusing on about the worst case scenario, that everything is planned, operationalized, and implemented through a human rights-based approach lens. That is really important, and that's what, in my personal opinion, is missing. And I think the UN agencies can bring a very significant experience from other countries. Third, I think the role of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, especially in contexts like Afghanistan, countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, and also involvement of the Gulf region countries, is who these countries and these organizations bring a solid understanding of the history behind the conflicts in these countries, the dynamics of the country. They have a pretty significant understanding of the culture, the religious dynamics, the societal structure. I think their role should be expanded and that we need to involve and hear from these countries and organizations. Lastly, I think this is of critical importance more than all of the other recommendations that I made. For strengthening and ensuring women's access to justice is the leverage that US government, the Europeans and other international allies bring is diplomatic leverage. That embassies in Afghanistan of all these countries and in other countries, of course, can work with the stakeholders, whether it's the government, the civil society, and even I think to this stage, we do have, I personally see, we do have leverage on the Taliban as well. We can negotiate that. And secondly, I think it's the financial leverage is really critical. I'm hoping that post-settlement in the ideal scenario, we do continue the assistance to Afghanistan and countries, the types of Afghanistan, but that those assistance are tied to conditionalities. One of the best lessons that we can learn from the past 19 years of billions and billions of assistance to Afghanistan is that we should conditional any kind of assistance we are providing. We should hold Afghan stakeholders accountable. And by stakeholders, I'm calling government, non-government, private sector, and civil society actors. We have to, that this famous proverb of not giving fish, but how to teach them to fish, to make it a sustainable process for Afghans themselves. And I would like to end by saying that our leverage to work with Afghan women on deconstructing toxic masculinity and helping them unlearn patriarchal manners and mindsets, especially not only at the bottom up, which is at the community level, but it's also top down, working with political parties to bring reform, working with religious leaders and leaders. Because one of the things that I confidently can say as an Afghan man is that unfortunately, the Afghan women and girls can't really trust their male counterparts, unfortunately. So I would end here, and I would be willing to take additional questions. Thank you.
Well, Fazelle, that was a full range of very good recommendations. And I know that our co-hosts, the UAE and Canada, are very engaged in Afghanistan, as are many of the missions who are listening to you today. And hopefully some of your good ideas will be reinforced in the context where decisions are being made, particularly at the UN. I also think you're laying out why gender analysis, which sounds so dry to so many people and so irrelevant, you have stated why it does make a difference and why it's important. We have very little time left, but Ali, perhaps we can just go to a couple questions quickly from our audience.
Sure. We'll do one round of questions here from one from Pema Dornenball. Removing formal legal obstacles is crucial. However, many women cannot reach formal institutions for their justice needs and in practice go to informal institutions. Do these informal institutions only form barriers or are they opportunities too? Another question, what are your recommendations concretely for addressing or engaging these already existing systems?
Okay, we have very little time, so if you can make your answer short, but I think anybody who wants to tackle, Fazelle, you had talked about the informal systems. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think the key here is having a strategy for aligning and bringing together the formal and informal justice system. The other challenge is that this is generational. Changing informal justice systems for the benefit of women and making it more equal and justice is a challenge. It's tied to wider societal change mindset. While it brings a threat, it could also bring an opportunity. I think it's really key that countries like Afghanistan should adopt a policy, a national policy framework to work with the TDR and institutions to equip them, to train them, to capacitate, if I could say, but then also in place advisors from formal justice sector system to work with them is really key. The other key is awareness raising, education, making sure that educated Afghans are incorporated into the TDR systems, especially those with legal, paralegal, or semi-legal education and knowledge, but Islamic and non-Islamic. That could be a good beginning in the longer term.
Does anyone else want to respond to the question?
Could I respond? It's Sandy.
Sure,
here.
Sandy, go ahead.
I agree with Fazelle on that one as well, is we can't ignore the informal justice systems. They're there for a reason, mainly because they're quick and they're accessible, etc. And they're an important fabric of life. But we need to look at things alongside and modernize at the same time. And one thing I would just one comment I would make is often when you look at informal justice systems in various countries, often women are not involved in those informal justice systems. So that would be the first thing that I would say is that you can't just sweep them aside and ignore them because they play an important role, but they do need to be modernized and women need to play a part in them too. And that's what I would just add to what Fazelle said. Thank you.
Excellent point. Ali, I think we're out of time, more than out of time at this point. So we're going to have to close down, but I hope that our audience gleaned a lot of important information, recommendations, but also real understanding of why inclusive justice is so important to build post-conflict societies in a way that really does lead to sustainable peace and stability. and women's participation in all of that, and in this justice sector that we've been discussing, is so critical. So I want to thank everybody who was involved today. I really want to thank our co-host, to Ambassador O'Neill and Canada, and also to salute Canada for its ELSI initiative on helping to reduce barriers, investigate why these barriers exist for women in UN peacekeeping missions. And of course, to the UAE for your consistent commitment, Lana, to these issues. I invite our participants today, our audience, back for our fourth session we will announce shortly in this series, which will be focused on security sector reform. So thank you for what you are doing. You're constantly doing heavy lifting on this issue, and we're all very grateful. And to our esteemed panelists, to Sandy, Fazelle, and Claudia, may you continue to do your good works. We really understand how much you are doing because of what you were able to tell us today, giving us insights into the work that we need to be adding to, enhancing, sustaining, and strengthening. So may you continue to both guide us, but to continue to do the works you're doing in the positions in which you find yourselves. So thank you to all. The work goes on, and we hopefully will be back together soon. Stay well. Bye-bye.